This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on power sector leaders, we're going to talk to Judi Greenwald, President and CEO of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, or NIA, which supports the emergence of new nuclear technologies. Judy's going to describe what the alliance does, what it's accomplished, and what its current priorities are. Judi has headed the alliance since 2020 and also heads Greenwald Consulting. In her now over 4-decade career in environment and policy, she's worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the White House Climate Change Task Force. She also served in executive positions at the Pew Center, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and the Department of Energy. So you can see that everybody wants Judi, and we get her today. Judi, what is the Nuclear Innovation Alliance? What is its history? And what is its mission?
Thanks so much for having me. So NIA is a little think and do tank. Our mission is to help create the conditions for success for new nuclear energy so it can play a major role as an energy security and climate solution. We see those conditions for success as achieving competitive cost, getting to market, public acceptance, and scaling. And as with pretty much any energy innovation in the United States, a lot of that is up to industry. And so we need industry to lead on energy innovation, but we also need the government, particularly the federal government for really big energy. We need them to enable this innovation because it's the kind of thing that works with the private sector and the public sector taking actions that are mutually reinforcing. And then ultimately, the private sector can take off on its own. And we've had a lot of experience in our country with different technologies taking that path. And we're in the beginning of it for new nuclear energy. We think you need a whole of society approach to get to these conditions. And in addition, obviously, to industry. So it's the government, it's industry, it's also civil society. And we think that the key areas to help enable that this success or these conditions for success that we focus on are licensing, modernization, public investment, and private investment. And that's the areas that we focus on. We've been around for about 8 years, depending how you count, or 9 years. I joined in 2020. And our priorities now are, actually, I'll get into the priorities with your next question.
Yeah. So this series is about introducing leaders in the power sector, and the alliance is trying to lead the emergence of new nuclear technologies. So tell us exactly what you think of as new nuclear technologies, and tell us a little bit about what you're doing. You mentioned public-private sector participation. You mentioned participation of the industry. Uh, can you give us some examples of how you've worked with those various groups um, to support these new technologies, and of course tell us as you go what these new technologies are?
Or I guess I'll start with the new technologies, and a great resource if your audience is interested in is we have a primer on our website, which goes through what the different leading technology options are, how they're different, how they're the same, what their benefits are, and what their challenges are. So I'd highly recommend that if people want to really dig in.
Yeah,
Basically,
I went through that primer myself, and I would recommend it to the audience as well.
oh, that's great. That's great to hear. So
Is that,
generally
I don't
speaking,
remember, I don't, excuse me, Judy, I'm really sorry to cut you off there, but the website, it's what is it? It's
it's
NIA.
nuclearinnovationalliance.org. Sorry, it's so
Okay.
long. You actually have
Yeah,
to type in all
yeah,
3 words. Yes,
yeah. Okay, Nuclear Innovation
alliance.org.
Alliance.org. Okay.
Yeah,
So
that's
go ahead,
it.
I interrupted you. You were talking about, I think you were about to go to how you've worked with some of these technologies and
Yeah,
the
I guess I'll start with what the technologies are and how, I mean, there's a little bit of debate or a range of views about how to define things. So we generally talk about new nuclear and conventional nuclear. Not everybody agrees on the precise definitions, but generally speaking, the new nuclear technologies that are generating a lot of excitement are at least as safe as the existing nuclear technologies, which we think are quite safe, and perform at least as well. And we think the existing nuclear energy plants that we have, certainly in the United States, perform very well. But they're even better in one or more ways. And the ways that they can be better are, one, conventional nuclear technology tends to come in one size, and it's a very large size. And there are reasons that we evolved that way for economies of scale and other purposes, but not everyone needs that large an increment of new energy. So these new technologies come in multiple sizes. They can be from anywhere from a microreactor, which might be useful for a remote application or a defense application, a remote community. Even there's some interest in oil field operations. So that's kind of an interesting new wrinkle on what nuclear energy might look like. There are also a number of technologies that are of interest to industry for a couple of reasons. They come in somewhat smaller sizes than the very large plants, maybe more like the size of a natural gas plant, 200-300 megawatts. And they can fit better at a smaller industrial site or a more constrained industrial site. And also a number of them can produce high temperature heat as well as electricity. So you have more use cases, more sizes, more opportunities. And there are a range of these. There's probably 60 or so companies in the US working on different types of technologies. They all have different degrees of promise and challenge. And we're very excited to see ultimately who succeeds. Probably not all of them are going to succeed, but we think a number of them will succeed, because you don't just have one purpose for these. There's multiple different purposes, and we can imagine different technologies would succeed in different niches. And that's kind of what's going on now. Our role, I would say,
Excuse me just for a second. We had Patrick White from the Alliance on the podcast some time back, and he was saying there is this sort of process of learning for these new technologies, and he mentioned that this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It's sort of far out there. That's why I'm interested in examples of what you're doing. So I just wanted to mention that folks can find podcasts about the timeline involved here. But please, I'm sorry to interrupt, and please continue.
No worries. So we're expecting demonstrations of a number of these technologies this decade and commercialization in the next decade and beyond. And we are in a bit of a race. So different technologies are going to take different amounts of time. The more evolutionary technologies are likely to come in sooner, although you never know which ones are going to win in the end. And some of the more radical changes, maybe radical is not a great, the more deeply innovative changes may actually wind up pulling ahead because of the additional uses that they can provide. So we don't know yet who's exactly going to win, but we have a number of companies who are doing innovation, I guess, on multiple fronts. They're doing business model innovation, technology innovation, as well as licensing innovation, which I'll get to at some of your follow-up questions. We can talk more about what's happening at NRC. But there's a lot that they have to go through. As with any energy innovation, we have to get through the early mover project phase, which is challenging. And we're in that now. And as we get through the early mover projects, we'll have a better sense of what the ultimate timeline is for full-scale commercialization.
Are there any specific examples of what you've worked with that you could tell us just a little bit about before we move on?
Sure. So we are mostly active in the policy space. So we've had a number of, I would say, pretty big policy wins, not just us. Certainly, there's been a lot of people working on this. Nuclear energy innovation and advocacy and analysis is a team sport. And so there's been an alphabet soup, basically, of legislation that's been enacted over the past decade, from the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, NEMA, to the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Capabilities Act, NECA, the Energy Act of 2020, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Advance Act. There's just been a really remarkable amount of legislation encouraging innovation in the nuclear energy sector. And we've been part of that whole process. We do a lot of analysis and provide information to policymakers and advocate for policies that really help the nuclear energy industry. Right now, we are working a
Hang
lot
on just a
on
second.
making the case to defend these policies because we do have a new administration and Congress coming in who may not understand their benefits and how we got here and how important they are to the success of new nuclear energy. So we're particularly focused, for example, on making sure that the Loan Program Office remains well-funded and successful, that the clean electricity tax credits that were enacted a few years ago that apply to nuclear energy, that we can maintain those and including maintaining some of their key characteristics that are especially helpful for nuclear energy. We have these demonstration programs at the U.S. Department of Energy that we have to make sure are adequately funded and implemented. We have a fuel availability program at the U.S. Department of Energy that is designed to jumpstart a domestic enrichment capacity, which is really important for our energy security, as well as enabling nuclear energy so it can be a climate solution. So there are a ton of policies that have been put in place that we're working hard to maintain. And then there's also some additional policies that we're looking at pursuing. The
Okay,
other
we'll
thing
get to that.
we've done,
Sorry. Go ahead and finish your thought. I want to move on to something else. And we're going to
yeah,
get to these other policy questions in a few minutes, but I want to move on to something else before we get there. So go ahead, but please finish your thought.
yeah, the other thing we spent a lot of time on is catalyzing private sector action. So we work closely with companies, with investors. We do a lot of investor education, making sure that they understand the value proposition for new nuclear energy more broadly. We are we're primarily funded by philanthropy, so we're a public interest group in favor of new nuclear energy. So we don't advocate for any specific technology or company, but broadly speaking, we make the case for new nuclear energy, for the promise of the innovation, for the commercial promise, for the reasons that we need it for climate and energy security. And so we do a lot of work. We have a whole set of papers that we do that are more targeted for an investment audience, although all of our work is useful to decision makers in both the public and the private sector.
Okay, yeah, you mentioned the importance of these new technologies is that they will drive decarbonization and they're going to strengthen U.S. energy security. I know you don't like to distinguish among your children which is your favorite, but I really would appreciate it if you could just describe some of the leading ideas very briefly. Like we hear a lot about these small modular reactors, and we hear about different kinds of fuels that don't have as much problem with storage, fuel storage. And if you could just say something about some of these technologies and how they fit into the current and future energy mix before we move on, just a little bit, if you could.
Sure. I'll give an example because there was just an interesting, well, one of the things that's sort of fun about working on new nuclear energy is there's always these announcements, like there's always something happening and going on. So we just got an announcement, it was either today or yesterday, that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepted the application from X Energy and Dow for their reactor that's going to be built in Seadrift, Texas. And that's a really interesting small modular reactor. It's interesting on a number of fronts. It's a high temperature gas reactor, so it actually can produce high temperature heat, which is also useful to Dow, and it can fit on a site, site of one of their chemical plants. And it's interesting not only for this project itself, but also Dow is interested that if it's successful, and of course this is a public-private demonstration program that the U.S. Department of Energy is cost sharing with X Energy, and Dow is investing as well as other investors. So this is one of these public-private partnerships that had to win a competition to get the federal funding, and it's proceeding with both the risk appetite that the federal government can bring, as well as the commercial know-how that the private sector can bring. And so the project is interesting in and of itself for a lot of reasons. And it's also interesting because Dow has aspirations, if this project works out, to actually do a lot of these. And they have a lot of chemical plants here and abroad who could use this technology as well. So it's
And we
part of
should explain.
Dow's agenda to both decarbonize and have reliable energy 24/7. And so
Yeah,
this is an interesting option for them and could lay the groundwork for many of these plants.
yeah, we should explain to our listeners that the idea is that there are chemical processes that require so much energy that clean electricity can't really develop the level of heat that they need. And so a technology like these new nuclear plants, they have heat that they can provide for these chemical industrial processes. And that's a unique benefit that, let's say, perhaps wind and solar may not be suitable for. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a
Mm.
lot of interest in the industrial sector in nuclear energy for that reason. They also need a lot of power, regular electricity. But yes, a lot of them need high temperature heat. So that's interesting. And you
And just to clarify, this is that announcement was a demonstration project in Texas. Um, so when will it come online, and when will after that will we know whether it's something that can be scaled? Do
Yeah,
you think?
so they're starting to do a number of things now. There's a lot of processes and steps before you're actually fully constructed. The announcement that was just made either yesterday or today is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepted their license application from
Mm,
Dow and X Energy. So that's sort of the first step in the licensing process. And as I mentioned earlier, you have to do a lot of things in parallel. You have to do your business model innovation, you have to do your licensing innovation, and you have to do your technology innovation. So they are in the process of beginning various aspects of the construction, making sure they get their license, making sure that their design is good, making sure they have their financing. So a lot of things are happening in parallel. And I expect, or what we've read, is that they will be online later this decade or early in like 2030, early 2030 to 2032.
mm. Okay, Judy, we don't have we have one more question I really want to get to with as much fulsomeness as possible. The Alliance is very concerned about reforms that are needed at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You know as well as anybody what those reforms are because you worked at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Tell us about the reforms that are needed before we get done with this podcast.
Sure. So we think about Nuclear Regulatory Commission reform in 3 phases, and we actually have a nice little 2-pager on our website if you're interested, called The Urgency of NRC Reform, which lays this out and also links to the body of work that we have. We've gone pretty deep on understanding how licensing works now and what needs to change. And there's basically 3 timeframes. One is what's happening now, which is a number of early movers are coming to NRC and looking to get their licenses for these new designs. And the NRC rules have mostly evolved to be a bit more specific to conventional technology. So
Mm,
what has to happen now is that NRC and the companies, in a way, it has to be done a bit collaboratively, have to identify flexibility in the existing rules and get these things licensed and make sure that you're not applying rules that don't make sense to new technologies. At the same time, NRC has to be convinced by the companies that what they're proposing is safe and they have a good case for their safety. And that's happening now. It takes a bit. It's been getting faster, which we're pleased about, but the first few are going to take longer while the NRC gets more comfortable with the designs and while the companies get more comfortable figuring out how to get them licensed under existing rules. The next time frame that's important is the midterm, and that's a rulemaking that's happening now called Part 53, because that's where it is in the Code of Federal Regulations. And that's a rulemaking that's been taking a few years. It's got a little bit of time left, and that's to have an alternative approach that's more open to the new technologies. So the idea is that it would be more efficient at licensing a wider range of designs. And there's been a lot of work at the NRC and public comment, and we're kind of in the middle of that process. And the hope is that that will make things go faster. And then ultimately, what we need to see and what we advocate for and we think is possible is what we call high volume licensing. And that we have to go through these earlier phases to get to that phase of licensing. But that's when we've had a process of essentially down selection, which is not just sort of one entity saying this is the right technology. It's a process. It's a process where the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is determining which set of these technologies is safe and which can get a license. It's a process of the customers and investors deciding what's worthy of investing and buying. And it's the actual early mover projects demonstrating that they're successful and they can actually build and operate. And out of this process, there are going to emerge some winners. And then the idea is that you'd have standardized replication of those winners. And one of the interesting things I probably should have mentioned earlier is particularly the smaller plants have greater capability of having components being manufactured. So you can get economies from manufacturing multiple components, or what some people call economies of multiples, instead of the economies of scale at the very large conventional reactors that tend to be stick built and bespoke. So we imagine this process where you're going to standardize designs, you're going to be able to more rapidly build and replicate these plants. And then in parallel, you should be able to more rapidly license multiples. So the NRC has seen it before, they can quickly license the second, the third, the nth. And so that will get into a point where we'll be building faster, we'll be licensing faster, and we'll be at scale. But we do have to get through these early processes to make sure that we are confident in their performance and that they actually work in the real world.
Great. Okay. That's a great place to leave it, Judi. Our power sector is going through a lot of change, and it's very much a process. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's exciting to have folks like you and the Alliance out there working to make the process work better. My guest has been Nuclear Innovation Alliance President and CEO Judi Greenwald. She's been describing what the Alliance is, what it does, what it's accomplished in the past, and what its current priorities are in support of new nuclear technologies. I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.